And as you all know, Dr. Daniel Volker, the ambassador of Switzerland in Canberra, and it's also an interesting moment which I'll let His Excellency elaborate on, but moving from his current career to academia, so it'll be an interesting transition there. But I'll just give a very brief overview and then pass it over to Dr. Volker, after which Patrick will chair a discussion, so there should be plenty of time for discussion in the last quarter hour or more. Okay. So His Excellency Daniel Volker has been Swiss Ambassador to Australia, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu since August 2008. He was Swiss Ambassador to Singapore and Brunei Darussalam from 1998 to 2002. So as you can see, that's a really interesting, vast experience. He was first and founding director of the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, with the rank of ambassador on leave from Swiss MFA. Daniel has been Counsellor for European Affairs, then Minister Counsellor and DCM, Swiss Embassy in France, Deputy Head, European Directorate, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Berne, and Counsellor and DCM, Swiss Embassy in Sweden. He has a PhD in International Law from the University of Zurich and is trilingual in German, French and English, with notions of Italian and Swedish. So we're in for a very fascinating talk. As many of you would know, the Australian the Asian Century White Paper is gathering a lot of discussion, and I think this is, we're in for a fascinating talk from a perspective from Europe with all of this grounded experience in this region. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Daniel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, Max already said it. This is pretty much the end of, actually in my case, it's 35 years in the Swiss Foreign Ministry. The assignment of 4 years here in Australia is the last one I have, and I do move into academia, teaching a little bit. So you're sort of guinea pigs, you know. At the end, you can say that thumbs up or thumbs down. If it's down, well, I hope none of my future employers, that it's actually going to be the University of St. Gallen, our big business school, is in here. Probably not. Ladies and gentlemen, as you will see in that handout, it's small topics that I'm going to talk about here. Europe, Australia, and China. Of course I will talk about Europe. The Swiss are very European. They're not members, as you know, Switzerland, Norway, and a few very, very small European countries are not member of the EU. However, Switzerland is a very European country with three of the big European languages and cultures right there in the country, geographically also in somewhat the center of Europe, etc., etc. Australia is the fascinating country and continent that I've been working and living for the last 4 years together with my family. Our 2 children are back in Europe as students, but for my wife and myself, we've been traveling all over the country, visiting with a lot of universities. I did my first visit at Monash, that's 3 years ago, you know, the official thing where you're met by the Vice Chancellor, etc. But, and we're keeping up the relationship. Probably you think embassies and universities, you know, why? What is this? There's a lot there. Embassies are also there to help, to see where the needs are, to help universities and the principals in education and science to do their exchanges, to do their studies better. Obviously, governments and in extension embassies are not there to actually engineer this cooperation. The cooperation happens because students want to do exchanges, because researchers want to work together. We have one gentleman in here, an old Australian friend of mine who started out as a student in Switzerland and now is an eminent medical professor here at Monash. And you know, he would know better than anybody else that researchers get together because they're interested in each other's research. However, governments have a role to play in that context, and it's of course to make it easier for those who want to cooperate to do so. So the contacts with universities on my part have been active and manifold here in Australia. Since a good year, my embassy in Canberra has an education and science counsellor in the person of Dr. Christian Schneider, who sits up there, who has degrees both from Switzerland and this part of the world. Not Australia, but New Zealand. That's good enough. And this just to show you that embassies are not something highly political somewhere up there, and nobody knows exactly what they're doing except for drinking cocktails and talk a lot. Embassies are extensions of their governments, of their administrations especially, and they better get down there and see what really is going on. So if this sounds like a plaidoyer for my line of work, for my old line of work, that's exactly what it is. We do need a lot of good people in international relations. And I guess your presence in this seminar and in this context here at Monash is an indication that maybe one or two of you, or even more, do think of a career in the public sector, in your ministry, or in your Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or in other ministries. And if that is the case, I can only encourage you to do so. But now let's get into the topic. Europe, of course. Oh, I didn't say why I would speak about China. I haven't even served in China. I've been traveling in China. I do happen to think if you have the possibility nowadays, and if you want to be in international relations, you better make sure you know what's going on in China. China is, of course, not Asia. There's a lot of Asia out there that is not China. But China is the largest Asian country, and it will be the very dominating force in the Asia-Pacific of the future. Let's first quickly talk about Europe. I put down crisis and redemption. I don't have to repeat to you. I mean, you're all there. You're all interested in international relations. Obviously, Europe and the euro especially is in a crisis. It's not quite as bad as it is made out to be quite often. Among other places, especially also in this country. This country's media are somewhat dominated by Mr. Murdoch, News Corporation. I'm going to start making a few remarks here that normally ambassadors shouldn't make, since I'm soon going to go out of profession. Ladies and gentlemen, it's quite a serious problem. News Corporation that controls almost 70% of all the media in Australia is basically anti-European. Mr. Murdoch is against Europe. Thus, the media transport information that is to a certain extent biased. The crisis is not as bad as it's sometimes made out to be, but it's bad enough. You'll probably have even a special lecture on what temporarily, I would say, went wrong with European integration, and especially with regard to Euro, so I'm not going to go into it. I would just like to remind everybody, and I mean, I'm not so much talking of Australia, but quite in general, when people say, oh, the Euro was a basic mistake. The Euro for a long time, and probably into the future, is a very good thing for all those involved with it. And even though Switzerland is not in the EU, and it has not adopted the Euro for the time being, the Euro, when you go to Switzerland, is a second currency there. If you go as a tourist into Switzerland, you can pay almost everywhere with the Euro. When you withdraw money at any ATM machine in Switzerland, you will get Swiss francs, but on choice you will also get Euro, which very clearly means that the Euro is there to stay. We don't know yet whether Greece is actually going to leave the Eurozone. My guess is that this is not going to happen, but even if it happens, this is not the end of the Euro. Let me come to that second point, the importance of Europe for Australia and Asia. I've got quite a few figures that one of my colleagues at the embassy put together. And I'm going to put it very bluntly. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll do this almost staccato-like. The European Union, ladies and gentlemen, and then as the Swiss envoy I always say, plus Switzerland and Norway. These are the main economic powers, economic factors in Europe that are not in the EU as an institution. Thus, the EU as a bloc, and you can look at the EU as a bloc because it's a free trade area. And of course, it does, in that sense, include also Switzerland and Norway, is still, and by a very far and large margin, the single most important economic partner of Australia, period. Exports to China, total exports to China now exceed slightly total Australian export to the EU plus Switzerland, but this can change once the prices of raw materials come down. But if you look at imports from the EU, and as I said, plus Switzerland and Norway, if you look at investment, then there is a sea of change. Just to give you, I mean, there's a sea of facts out there, rather, that show very clearly where the real economic interests of Australia lie. I put this very bluntly because one hears so much of the relationship of Australia with China is all important, and ladies and gentlemen, it is. As I said, China is going to be and will be for at least quite some time the most important presence in the Asia Pacific. However, if you look at the economic figures, you see very clearly that at this time and for quite a long time to come, as I said, the main economic relations are with Europe. Just to give you one figure, the investments from Switzerland are the 5th most important into Australia. They're the 2nd European after the UK, and they're far larger than all the investments of China together, without Hong Kong. But just to, I mean, these are the facts, these are the figures, beyond the assumptions and perceptions. Let me then go on, and I also put down a bullet point of European integration. We'll see how this works. Not in the least, now that I go back to my own country, there is an ongoing discussion in Switzerland, of course, also. In our case, it's still about should we join or not the EU. Right now, those who say, oh, weren't we very wise not to join the EU with all the problems that they have the upper hand. But this can change, and this can change very quickly. Then we come now to Australia. Obviously, I'll be happy to answer questions and to discuss a little bit more about this European side. Let me come now to Australia. Again, I put it quite bluntly there. 3 areas which are challenges, as we say in diplomatic language for Australians. For diplomats, there are 3 challenges for Australia, as we say as diplomats. I put down here which need improvement. It's infrastructure. Infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. Again, this is a very large country. However, the infrastructure, even given the size and the relatively limited budgets of the public sector, infrastructure is not good enough in Australia. I think that's, one can quite bluntly state that. Since 20 years, there should be a bullet train between Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne. Very clearly. It could have been, but it was not done. And there are some other infrastructure needs. Productivity, that is sometimes something that within Australia is often discussed. Productivity is, again, you would probably have to have a special lecture of that. But it has, of course, to do with the fact that this is the lucky country. This is a country that is endowed with a lot of riches, and that especially during the 20 years, both due to skills, to dedication, but also due to the fact that it is a resource-rich country, had a relatively easy ride. Those resources were always in demand and are still being in demand. One has to be very careful to not lose the productivity in other areas than the resource industry. I also put down industrial skills, and again, to be a little bit blunt, to a certain extent it's a bit of a shame that Australia went down the path, if I may say, of the Anglo-Saxon model. not of the continental European model that puts a lot of emphasis on apprenticeships, on industrial skills that are being taught to all of those many young people who will never be prospective Nobel Prize winners. They are not at the top of their top universities, but they are the broad middle class of educated and highly educated people who, together with their academic knowledge, they also acquire practical skills in the process of their education. But enough on challenges, ladies and gentlemen. I just put as the second bullet point here 3 assets. There are many more, but the resources, I don't even have to say anything about it. And you know, I made the experience here in Australia. Resources, Australians themselves are sometimes keen to say, oh, we just scratch to the earth and take out whatever is in there and then ship it away, like the iron ore. My own experience is a little bit different. My own experience is that there is quite a lot of R&D, research and development, in the resource industry. Sorry, it's not recording now? I better get behind that. Patrick warned me on that one. I better get behind that. I'm not sure whether it's worth recording, but anyway. There's a lot of R&D in the resource industry. I'm struck of that. When you come as a Swiss ambassador to Australia, you don't necessarily know a lot about the mining industry. You know, we know about the watch industry, the machine industry, even the chocolate industry when you're a Swiss envoy, but not the mining industry. But of course, there are now some quite large companies that are Swiss mining companies, such as Xstrata. In the future, maybe even Xstrata and Glencore together. And one learns very quickly. Visiting with them and seeing a coal pit and seeing a modern copper mine and seeing all the technology that goes into the resource industry, I cannot put it any other way than taking off my hat and say this is a country where this side is pushed a lot, where a lot of resources go into there, which, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the reasons why, again, I put this now in a very staccato way, why Australia is going to go on for quite some time to sell its resources to countries like China. It's always said, oh, Australia is very dependent on China for bringing in its coal, for example. But the reverse is also true. China cannot do without the high quality, in-time delivery of Australian coal. This is always a two-way street. And of course, it's in time and it's high quality, whatever the resources is, because it's well researched, it's well funded, it's well done. So some of the complaints of the Australian mining industry within Australia, not enough of this, not enough of that, too many taxes, etc., are very well understandable, but they are relatively minor complaints for an industry that is at the remarkable high level. And I've talked to those people who make the future investment choices, not just Xstrata. You might not, I mean, how should we know? The world's largest cement maker is also Swiss. It's a company called Holcim, and under the label Holcim and Australia Cement. It's very active in this country. And they're mining also cement. What you start out is stone. And they mine, and when they make their big investment consideration, of course the cost of labor is a question, but also the stability of the system, the manpower the people who will work in this industry, etc. What I'm trying to say is that resources is an asset both because it's there, but because it's also worked on. I've already talked about the stability. Obviously Australia is a, whatever you call that, I put it in the next bullet point, a democratic capitalist system, a liberal democracy, a social market economy of a basic, I wouldn't say of a Western type, but I would say of a Western origin. Due process, law and order are things that are a given. So that's stability of the system. The educational system, as I was critical just before about some of the acquiring some of the skills that you need in industrial work. And I'll be equally positive with regard to basically the research and the research facilities in the universities that I've visited. Rob there knows that in the framework of a particular Swiss-Australian structure called the Swiss-Australian Academic Network, which is a network of researchers and professors, etc., not necessarily by passport, but who had something to do with Swiss universities and Australian universities, and grants from those two countries, etc. In that framework, I made the count the other day, something like 50 universities and research institutions in this country. And one cannot fail to be impressed how diversified, if you don't mind me saying this, Patrick, look, you have a European institution and one of the heads is a Kenyan. That is Australia for you. Australia has a big asset there of bringing so many talented people together in its higher education, in its leading research, etc. So these are all assets. And the last bullet point I put there is already, I've been talking about that. This country is functioning. And as much, and I understand that very well, as much as in Australia the discussion is that Australia should better know its neighbor, starting with PNG, Papua New Guinea, then of course Indonesia, huge country, and of course also China and other Asian and Asian Pacific countries. It cuts two ways. I make the observation, and let's say on a very in a very bottom-up perspective, that quite a few Asian Australians also become very Australian. So it really does cut two ways. This country probably, and Australians sometimes don't realize how much they're also a model. A role model is saying, probably this is not exactly the right expression, but how much they are also a way of demonstrating how successful a country can be in integrating the people, in trying to really harness the best of the people who come to a given country. And this sounds maybe a little bit holier than thou, but that's really the truth. With regard to integration, quite a lot of European countries, including Switzerland, would sometimes learn something from Australia with regard to integration. Let me now, ladies and gentlemen, come to that third point, China. Yes, I think I told Max I'm going to talk till about half past. Well, I've got a couple of minutes left, but that's enough for China, of course. No, of course it's not. And I'm really rushing through this. First bullet point, history. China was the Middle Kingdom. It has, if not the very oldest, one of the very oldest. It is great civilization. It was the Middle Kingdom. It was very much the center. And you know all these discussions. It's quite a story, of course, that till about roughly 200, 250 years ago, Chinese per capita, etc., the state of a lot of things was actually the highest in the world, and only then came with colonialism and the European powers. And it's a big story, but I think you can say that China has always been there and will, of course, always be there. What it probably won't be any longer, and this is a point, this is again one of these pointed things that ambassadors are not supposed to say, but it will probably never be the Middle Kingdom in a political sense as it was in the past, quite simply because there are now so many healthy, functioning, and I'm not saying Western or Eastern, healthy, functioning democracies around it. Look at Korea, look at Taiwan, look at Japan to a certain extent, look at other countries in the ASEAN, look at how elections go in countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, even in the country where I lived for 6 years, Singapore, not exactly known for its very rough and tumble democracy and so forth. even in that country that I still follow from very closely, from very close up, the last election went against the government, which is just one small indication that these countries have resolutely taken their fate in their own hands and will never, I'm going to use the old historic and terrible word, no-tow to the Middle Kingdom again. It's going to be a different Asia and in Asia Pacific. It's going to be the leading story for the 21st century. We hope very much to the good, not to the bad, you never know. But it's clear that this area, the Asia Pacific, is going to be the big main story, globally speaking. Quickly back to China, two points there. China is the factory of the world. What would we do without the industrial capacity of China right now? What would the world economy do if we wouldn't get that impetus from China, from the more or less unbroken productivity that comes out of this big country? The success in poverty reduction right within China, for all of those who have traveled, I've only started traveling in China about, well, once 25 years ago, and of course if you compare that to already 10 years ago, not today, not to talk of this yesterday or last year, it's absolutely staggering. The figures and the story is well known. Never has a country lifted so many people out of absolute poverty in so short a time. The danger in China, but it's a danger in all of our countries, is the income disparities. But again, this is a whole lecture for itself, so I just leave it out there. One of the greatest political thinkers, more than a political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, he's an American, they often are, he's the man who wrote The End of History. Well, that's actually not what he wrote, it's far more complex, but some of you will have read Fukuyama said the other day in I think it was a foreign policy, a long article in Foreign Policy, the anniversary issue of Foreign Policy, he asked the three questions: is the Chinese model exportable? Is it sustainable? Is it morally right? Again, I leave it out there for you also to think about it. He comes, interestingly enough, to quite a negative result on the three questions. I'm not even sure whether there aren't very solid reasons there to hold against him. I would quickly say about his last question, of course that's a delicate one sometimes, especially for diplomats, is the Chinese model as practiced right now fit to go into the future, because the Chinese, just like anybody else, and again, I'm very much against thinking in Western and Eastern models here. There was a time where the feudal system was the norm in Europe. Is the Chinese system able to satisfy the basic craving of every human being to be treated with decency by the powers that govern? That is the basic question. And of course, a long discussion can be held on that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll come to the conclusion. And again, if you have my little handout there, it says right there, you live in the right place at the right time. Right place I've been talking about, at the right time. Australia, contrary to what was the case before, when it was said, oh, Australia, oh yeah, far away, especially when we look from Europe. Australia is now pretty smack in the middle of this new Asia-Pacific larger area. You live in the right place at the right time, but complacency is a bit of a danger. I don't want to finish on a negative note, but it is sometimes. I know what I'm talking about because we Swiss tend to be a little complacent once in a while. Things are going well right now too, and almost all European countries, well, as I said, the more southern part of Europe is in crisis. The German economy is doing halfway good. Some other northern European economies are doing halfway good. The Swiss economy is doing actually quite okay. But when you do okay, then complacency is the next step, but you've always been on the guard for that. I think I pretty much kept in time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ambassador. Welcome to Monash University for the second time. My name is Hashim Abdul Hamid from Monash Asia Institute. In fact, I got an invitation only about 2 o'clock this afternoon when I checked my, but I thought it is an opportunity for me to speak to you at least. Yes, you mentioned about China, right? China is the biggest buyer of Australia's mineral resources, coal, iron ore, and of course uranium. This is well and good, makes Australia very, very rich, but there will be a time when the whole thing will finish. It's gone. A big hole in the ground. What are we going to do after that, especially when looking at our great-great-grandchildren in time to come? Your comment, please.
Patrick, how do you want to do this as an answer? Sure. No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. That's of course one of the big questions. Dual track economy is one of the expressions. I've been trying to answer some of the aspects of that. That I think the resource industry has a potential for R&D and to be broader than just, as I said, scratching up the ground and exporting what comes out. What I want to add here is that the infrastructure industry around mining is quite impressive. The next generation of Australians is going to probably build that famous second city on the western side of Australia right now. That's the whole coast towards the I want to say it wrong. Pilbara. Sorry? Pilbara, yeah. Sorry, coming back. The next generation will build that famous, some people call it now the Chinese city, because I think there are some discussions about the Chinese input in having a second city on that seaboard other than Perth. And of course that's a seaboard that faces the Indian Ocean. And as I said before, the Indian Ocean is part of the Asia Pacific. But I would also like to say that obviously one of the points here to mention is that productivity, you cannot let your industrial sector atrophy too much. That's what I try to say with the industrial skills. You have to have people who know technology and machine technology in general, and not just resource related. The Australian economy went through periods where the resources were not that important, at least not as important as they are now. There is basically no reason why it couldn't go back to that. But here comes the point, as I said, that this is not a time for complacency. And to make, again, a very politically incorrect statement, this is not the time to give in to every demand from the mining industry. Let me just make one point there, a very interesting discussion point that often comes up when I discuss with me, it's not just me, other European, whoever, other diplomats discuss with Australians, often also with politicians. The mining industry is asking to open up investment, which is good, basically. It's through trade and investment that the wealth is being created. However, countries are allowed, and actually should do so, to look exactly how much investment and in what areas. I don't even have to go into Australia. I can talk about my own country. What is resources for Australia what the mines are for Australia is high technology for Switzerland. And in the Swiss case, it wasn't so much, or it isn't so much the Chinese, but it's the Russians buying up some of the technology jewels that, meaning companies, that we have in Switzerland. There is a very justified and an easily explainable discussion on this very point. How much control a government, the public side, can cede on some of these really core resources that a country has. Thus, a very stupid answer to your question, it will depend on good policy and, as you said, not putting all your eggs in the same basket, evidently, especially not education-wise.
Thank you.
Ambassador, I would like you to comment on aspects of democracy. Coming from a country which in many regards is of course a model of democracy, the way you make decisions, the way people individually at a very local level have influence. And I'm now referring to China at the other end, but maybe via, for instance, the United States, where to run for public office one needs a hell of a lot of money to spend on campaigns. You know what's going on there presently. People are mentioning the figure of $1 billion that has to be spent in order to re-elect the President of the United States. Then you've got Australia, where small groups, small parties, because of our electoral system, you know, find it very difficult to see election into Parliament. The Greens have 13% of the vote, but they only have one seat. In China, of course, you know, things are developing, and you are quite right about how, indeed, the standards of living increase. But the outgoing Premier of China made some very, you know, prominent comments only a few days ago about corruption at government level and how it is so necessary to enlarge and intensify some form of, say, democracy. You know, I mean, construction workers, and I've seen it in China, you know, work 6 days a week and still get paid 15 times less than what their maybe lesser skilled, you know, counterparts receive in Australia. So we are not so much prepared, you know, to criticize as we ought to the lack of, you know, we call democratic progress.
Yes, one of the big questions, evidently. Let me first say something about a nice compliment with regard to democracy in Switzerland. Well, it's not better or no worse than anywhere else, let's say, in present-day Europe, especially Western Europe. Yes, we do have highly developed instrument, theoretical instrument of democracy, especially the referenda, of course. Quick parenthesis, did you know that the referenda that exists in Australia, which sometimes comes up, like when you voted about having having the present system or having a republic, came actually into the Australian Constitution on Federation through a Swiss Australian, a gentleman by the name of Henry Turdent from Queensland, who said why, and he came, of course, also from the US. And I'm coming to the second. You talked about the US. Did you know that California had many more referenda than Switzerland ever had? In California, they vote every month or every second month on a whole range of referenda. And California as such, I think, is if California would be a country, it would be the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world. So if you want to put it like this, as an application model, the state of California, and as an application model for referendums, the state of California is more interesting than Switzerland because it makes more of a difference as in a bigger country. Of course, it's true that money plays a big role. We see this right now with all the discussions of PACs and super PACs. But this is a tendency that we see everywhere. I'm afraid to say even our hallowed instruments of referendums in Switzerland have become very much an instrument in the hand of those who have the resources to push one particular line and to make you know, a lot of publicity on their opinion, etc. That's one of the very basic challenges for all our traditional old-style democracy. Namely that those who have resources have a little easier access to the levers and to the instruments, the tools of our democracies. And Switzerland is no exception for that, much to the contrary. The very last example, you might have even picked it up, it was even in the Australian, in some other media, international media naming. The Swiss just voted on whether we should have 6 weeks, I think it was, Christian, 6 weeks of vacation for everybody. And actually the Swiss, a majority, the title was everywhere, the Swiss voted against 6 weeks. Well, everybody has 5 already, that's not too bad, that's probably more than Australia legally. But be that as it may, and they say the Swiss voted against more vacation. When you analyze it, you see that there were about 40% of the population that went to the polls for that, and it was almost split evenly. So 20% of the Swiss said, no, we don't want more vacation, and probably most of them already have the 5 vacation, and so forth and so on. And what I'm trying to say is when you scratch at the surface of these institutions, they're sometimes not that great. Now, Australia and its electoral system. Interesting, of course, you have a clear Westminster system, a little bit tamed by the Senate, and it basically doesn't work so badly. Once you look longer than just a couple of weeks or a couple of months at the Australian Parliament, you really realize that quite a bit is pomp and circumstances, quite a bit is theatre thunder, as we call it, and the system works not that badly. Right now is a bit of a difficult period, obviously, because it's a minority government, but probably it leads Australia to become a little bit more compromise-minded with regard to the leading politician. I grant you it doesn't look exactly this way right now, but it's the way with coalitions, it's the way most countries are governed nowadays. And those political parties that realize, and again now I'm talking about our old traditional democracies, those political parties that realize that in the end politics is won in the middle are those who are responsible, are those who are successful. China, well, how can I even start answering your question? Again, only a few recent examples that we've seen in the media. With all my thunder that I gave with regard to information, you do get a lot of very interesting information out of China. We just saw about, did you pick that up in the media, about this locality, I forget the name, that had its own election. And it was granted the right to have an own municipal election because there have been serious problems with the political powers of that particular community, and actually the central government said, okay, you can run your own election. Very interesting. As we just saw, that the highest persons, all men in China, and before they I will believe a little bit more in real Chinese progress when I see more ladies up there in the decision-making, the highest decision-making places of China. But that thunder against corruption was reserved for one particular person. What was the name? His Chinese names. The one who was just the one who was just dismissed. Was he the fall guy? Would have there been a couple of others who deserved the same type of opprobrium? We don't know. On the political side, we still know relatively little what is really going on. It's a very, very big country. But the indications are clear. The individual citizen asks for basic decency. You don't even have to use human rights and all of this. You can discuss on this. Of course, it's very important. I'm not saying human rights is not an important principle. It's the most important but I'm talking here of the way you call it. Again, you want, as a citizen, you want to have a government that treats you as a person, not as a mass, not as a representative of a big, big faceless mass out there. And that is clearly not the case yet in China.
Well, thanks very much, Ambassador. The area that you've covered, if we have a lot of time, I'm sure there are a great many areas, so I'll keep it brief. I guess there are three things that spring into my mind, and I don't expect you to respond to them all, but whichever, if any of them grab you. I'm just thinking about your experience in this part of the world and having the European grounding. You have an unusual insight, I think. And taking the title of the talk rather than the three subtitles, thinking about Australia and the Asia-Pacific seen from a Swiss perspective. The first one is about the work that you've done in the Pacific, and we've talked quite a lot about industrialisation and mining and so forth, and I'm wondering about your experience with climate change and concerns about that. The second one is to do with EU and perhaps other blocs in this part of the world, like ASEAN, and are there potential lessons learned and so forth. The last is just to go back to the initial brief, and I think you've talked about this already, but if you'd be interested to just talk a bit more about what stood out as significant for you in the debate so far about the Australian Asian Century White Paper. You know, what do you think is, do anything seem bizarre? Are some things, are there misgivings? Are there sort of good insights? Because probably a lot of us don't have a lot of time to actually know what's going on in those debates. So thanks very much.
Yes. Again, as you said, a couple of lectures in there, or a couple of discussions. Climate change, I'm not at all an expert. That's one of the areas, basically as a diplomat, one should be a universalist. And I guess I have gone from one topic to the next. Well, you need a carbon tax, to put it very politically. Australia is clearly one of these countries that is now, of course, in Kyoto. We know that Kyoto is not really the flavor of the day any longer, but what comes after Kyoto. And I think especially the European partners of Australia hope very much that Australia will continue in that positive vein, since the Australian government, the new, at that time Labour, or at this time still also, but the then new Australian government decided to join Kyoto, and it's very much the hope that Australia will continue, because Australia matters in climate change. This is a continent. EU and structures, Asian structures, very interesting question. A lot of ink has already been spilled on whether the EU could be an example. When I was in Singapore, the question was compared to ASEAN, now to a larger Asia-Pacific area. Obviously, the answer is, at least on the surface, no. The EU is a particular European answer to a particular European situation, which we historically know what it was. The 20th century saw basically a European civil war that started in 1914 and extended to 1990. The First World War, a terrible interwar period, the Second World War, and then the Cold War. Obviously Europe concentrated, at least during the first half of the 19th century, of pretty much destroying the world itself, but in extension also the world. So it better got its act together better in the second part of the 20th century, and hopefully also into the 21st century. On the other hand, there are of course useful lessons to be drawn. The EU is already very advanced, especially when you look at it historically for the younger and the young countries of the Asia-Pacific. When you're a relatively young country, whether you were a colony before or like Australia, federated now since a good 100 years, when you're a young country, you're very normally, always historically speaking, more reluctant to cede parts of your sovereignty. I personally think but that's already very much the buzz, at least with the specialists and with the politicians. The East Asia Summit is a very interesting and incoming structure. The East Asia Summit has grown around ASEAN, but it's pretty much, and I love to tell this to my Australian colleagues, and especially to one politician who is not in the forefront anymore, but whom, since he was a foreign minister once in a while, and one could talk with him as an envoy, is pretty much the Asian Pacific community that Kevin Rudd first proposed. That was a far-sighted proposal at the time, and it was met with some derision, but the East Asia Summit is practically the same thing. East Asia Summit includes Russia, which wasn't in the initial Asia-Pacific community. The white paper of Ken Henry, very interesting, of course. It's not out yet. What is out, and one book that I very much recommend, you probably have read it, Max, and others will know it, is a relatively recent publication by the director of the Lowy Institute. You've probably heard of the Lowy Institute in Sydney, International Relations. And its director, Michael Wesley, published not so long ago a book called There Goes the Neighborhood, where he says more or less, Australia, wake up. The old comfortable way of being, the European outpost in Asia and Asia Pacific are over. The country has to start to make hard decisions with regard to its relationship with its Asian and Pacific neighbors. I'm not quite sure whether I agree with all the conclusions. And Michael has become a friend, and we have been discussing this once in a while. He's one of the best political thinkers of this country. The Lowy Institute, interestingly enough, is not very popular in Canberra, especially not with that great institution called DFAT, the Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is, I take off my hat. It's a great ministry. It's the one ministry I know, evidently, and it could be a real, or it should be a real source of pride for the Australians. I'm not saying DFAT is no good, but the interesting thing is that they have quite a discussion. I expect this dilemma, whether, the degree of intensity that Australia has to put in to deal with its neighborhood, I expect that to be reflected in the white paper of Ken Henry. I will read it out of curiosity and interest, not out of professional obligation.
So let's just take the last question.
Okay, Eva.
I was wondering about the current position of Switzerland in Europe. You mentioned before that you're already using the euros, you belong to the Schengen zone now. What it all means is that somebody else is setting the rules that apply to you. So my question would be, when exactly are you going to become a member of the European Union? Consider that you will make those rules, and in case it does say it's negative, how do you imagine yourself, what's your plan for maintaining relationships in the century of blocs, alliances? How are you going to play with the giants like China or Japan when everyone flocks together and you remain alone? What's the plan?
Eva, I can only say I'm going to bring you to Switzerland. Because you're so right. I made it to Swiss Ambassador Australia, never even close to be anything like the foreign minister, like Kevin Rudd. After all, he started as a diplomat. He made it to first prime minister and foreign minister. But if he had made it to prime minister of Switzerland, which I'm not, we don't even have a prime minister, but into any kind of political important relation, it's exactly what I would tell my Swiss. I'm not the right person to talk to, because I've been, since I can think politically, since my early student day as a law student, I've been an unconditional proponent of a very fast accession of Switzerland to what was then the European community, is now the European Union, etc., etc. The question is that the answer to your questions is that most Swiss just push that away a little bit. There is no way Switzerland as a relatively small country, a medium-sized economy with population-wise 7.2 million inhabitants now, or is it 7.8? Almost 8 million inhabitants, middle-sized, medium-sized economy in the European sense. It can deal with these big questions on its own, simply cannot. What we already do today is often saying we're very autonomous, but we do, of course, look at what our European colleagues are doing. That's simply a fact. This would probably get me thrown out of the Swiss Foreign Ministry. You know, we're not working like this, but it's a fact.
All right. And I note, may I ask all of you to join me in thanking myself for these Your Excellency, we also have energy and environmental transition.
That's the one thing
You
you
are
asked.
from Australia. Energy sector.
That's your That's your
I would also like to thank the Monash European EU Centre team, as well as the Monash Social Institute team, and of course, Dr. Christus for having made this day a success, and thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.